When I think of the Game Boy Advance, I remember back to very specific moments of my childhood. I remember sitting in the backyard on our outdoor swinging chair. The sky was a hot orange. It must have been around 5 or 6 p.m. I was playing Pokemon Mystery Dungeon on one of the original Game Boy Advance models, and I was listening to Saving Me by Nickelback on my iPod. It's strange how something like a game can engrave such lucid memories. There are plenty of other memories I have just like that one, all of which I was playing the Game Boy Advance. Occasionally, I think back at these memories, and it's began to rekindle a desire to play a Game Boy Advance game again. Because I'm Dr. Modalot, normally I would go and play these games using an emulator, but this was more for the nostalgia, and to achieve that properly, I needed an actual handheld. So I began to go around and do some research to learn what the best model of the Game Boy Advance was. While all of them are great for their own reasons, they all have their own flaws as well. The original Game Boy Advance model doesn't have a backlight. The Game Boy Advance SP is a little too small for my hands, and the Game Boy Micro is even smaller. Now, it is possible to fix some of these issues with hardware mods, but then the handhelds end up becoming very expensive. The Game Boy Advance with a pre-installed backlight mod can be found on eBay, but it costs over $130 in most cases. The SP model is cheaper, but it's still about $105 or more if you get one in mint condition. Buying used is of course always an option, but I was aiming for something in very good condition. Unless you get lucky, it can be difficult to find one in newer condition at a fair price. In my search for a Game Boy Advance system to use, I came across this device. Well, it's inside the box. It's called the Revo K101 Plus. It's a Game Boy Advance clone console that promises to bring features that you won't find on a standard Game Boy Advance. That sounds like it fits the bill. I went ahead and purchased it for $105, 5 of it being for the shipping price of the US. It's very close to the price of an SP, but it could be very well worth it if it includes some additional features. Enough talk though, let's go ahead and pop that box open. A nice, minimalistic black box is used for the system. When you pop off the lid, the Revo is sat on the very top, all wrapped up in a plastic sleeve. Inside the box we have some additional accessories. We have a mini USB cable with a USB power adapter, a good choice of cables so it's easy to replace if it gets lost or damaged. It also comes with 2 screen protectors made just for the Revo, even having these easy to install tabs on it. And lastly is the inclusion of an AV out cable. Well, that's very nice. We'll be definitely checking this out towards the end of the video. The first thing I do immediately when I get a new device is I pick it up and I start to press the buttons to see how it feels. And to my disappointment, well, not too great. The plastic used for the handheld feels pretty cheap, kinda like plastic they use for the newer PlayStation 3 controllers. The D-pad works okay, and so do the start and select buttons, but the other face buttons are just mushy. They don't click like the buttons on a Game Boy Advance, and that's kind of a letdown. The Revo does have these additional X and Y buttons, and they're used as alternatives to the left and right shoulder buttons. And that's definitely a good inclusion to the Revo because the shoulder buttons are abysmal. They feel incredibly cheap and they rock around everywhere inside of the casing. I've even managed to get them stuck by tilting them a little bit. It feels awkward to press them too because they have so much travel before they actually click. The left shoulder button doesn't even click at all. The right shoulder does once you press it in all the way, but the left one has a little more resistance, so it doesn't feel like it actually has a click to it at all. I'm not saying that I'm any good when it comes to designing a handheld, but this is kinda sloppy. The Revo also has a brightness button on the top, a power button on the left side, and a hard reset switch on the bottom next to the audio out port. Another oddball decision was the placement of the speaker. It's below the right face buttons and my thumb ends up muffling it pretty frequently when I hold the Revo. Unless you plan on using headphones, that might get pretty annoying. Now, it can't be all bad though. There's one good thing to mention about the Revo's design, and that's its saving grace. It's very comfortable to hold. The Revo is about the same size as the original Game Boy Advance, so it has plenty of room for my large hands thanks to that landscape layout. I can easily see myself playing the Revo for many hours at a time without any sort of cramping. Now that we've looked over the system's exterior, let's get to playing a game. We'll try out, well, the one game I could find, Star Wars Flight of the Falcon. The cartridge slot is on the bottom and the game fits nice and snug into it. And then we turn on the Revo. Okay, so you actually have to hold down the button for about 2 seconds to turn it on. That's actually helpful so that if you accidentally press the power button, it won't turn on or off. The Revo functions just as you would expect a Game Boy Advance to, even has the Game Boy Advance splash screen when it loads up. I do have to give a bit of praise to the Revo team for the screen they chose for this handheld. The colors are vibrant and the sprites pop. It's slightly larger than the screen of the Game Boy Advance as well. I'm definitely glad they didn't skimp out on the display quality. So far, the game works just like it should, no issues with graphics or sound. I've read that the speaker on the Revo sounds a little tinny compared to the Game Boy Advance, but I haven't really noticed it. There was one additional accessory included with the Revo that I haven't mentioned yet. For me, this was the selling point of the system. When you pull the Revo out of its box, it actually already has a cartridge in the slot. This is the Revo K card, the Revo team's answer to the Game Boy Advance flash cards. It's jam-packed with all sorts of features, and it's built to work specifically for the Revo K101 Plus. It actually doesn't work with any other system. But why doesn't it work on other systems? Well, to be true, the K card only provides an access point for a microSD card. The microSD card can be up to 32 GB in size, and it's used to store ROM files for games in Homebrew or other files such as pictures, music, and text documents. The real work is being done by the Revo itself. The additional features of the Revo and the K card are managed by an onboard ARM9 processor. This additional processor is exclusive to the Revo handheld, so the K card won't even boot up if you were to try to use it in a Game Boy Advance. You just insert it into your Revo and turn it on just as you would normally. This time though, we get a very different looking screen on the boot up. After the Revo team splash is shown, we're dropped into a basic navigation menu that consists of 3 pages. The first page is for navigating files and folders, the second page is used for changing system settings, and the last page gives system information such as special hotkeys you can use, compatible file types, and some other information. Alright, let's go ahead and boot up Star Wars again. It boots up just as the cartridge did, except this time it needs to be loaded onto the DRAM of the Revo first. Once in game, we can start messing around with the hotkeys. There are a ton of available functions you can perform, and that's the big highlight of the Revo. By pressing the brightness button in combination with another button on the system, you'll activate one of these functions. The hotkey you'll probably use the most is the brightness button and the left shoulder button. This opens the menu to adjust settings or return to the file browser. Other functions include activating cheat codes, dumping your save file onto your microSD card, switching between the AV out and the LCD screen, changing between PAL or NTSC format, changing the aspect ratio, activating autofire, turning on the internal real-time clock, which is necessary for Pokemon games, and activating sleep mode. So yeah, there's a lot that you can do with this thing. Dumping your save file though is one of those things that you're going to have to do a lot. You can't just create an in-game save because there's no cartridge for the game to save to. You'll lose that save file as soon as you turn off the Revo. To compensate for that, the save dumping function allows you to create or update a save file onto your microSD card. That save file will be automatically loaded into your game from then on. You can actually use this to create backup saves for your ROM files as well. Just be sure to copy the backup save file to a different location, otherwise it will be updated next time you perform a save dump. The Revo does have the capability of running cheat codes off of your microSD card, basically making it a built-in Game Shark. I haven't actually tested it though. You can also have your file list show screenshots of your games as you scroll through them. Now the reason I mention both of these is because both the cheats and screenshots have to be downloaded and set up in the same fashion. You can go to the official Revo website. There are links and instructions provided there for setting up the screenshot and cheat folders. One thing I wanted to take note of was the Revo's battery. It's not at all what I hoped for. It's an 890 mAh battery that lasts only a fraction compared to the original Game Boy Advance, about 6 hours compared to the Game Boy Advance's 15 hours. Rechargeable Li-ion batteries don't usually last as long as a regular battery, but that's a pretty big difference. On top of that, there seems to be some kind of software glitch with the battery tracking. I found when I would adjust settings on the Revo, the battery gauge would fluctuate up and down. It wasn't always clear as to how much battery I actually had left. At least it still feels like a Game Boy Advance when I'm playing it. It's not perfect though. I found that in my game testing some games would have glitches. Nothing that made a major impact, just some graphical issues such as backgrounds not loading or sprites having some abnormalities. I haven't played many of these games though, so who knows if there are maybe some bigger issues later on. I've looked past a lot of this though. Playing the Game Boy Advance games feels just fine once you get into it. It certainly helps to have such a great looking flawless screen like this. What's that? That there. Is that? No. No, you've got to be kidding me. A stuck pixel? I'll be honest, I saw it after having only turned it on twice. I can understand after some time having a pixel get stuck or die, it happens. But straight out of the box? Really? Just when I think things for the Revo are going alright, this little darn red pixel waves his arms shouting hello to me. And it's not like I'm going to ask for a replacement over this one pixel. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't. This took over a month to receive since it came from the Netherlands. Moving on, another good feature for the Revo is the capability of emulating a few other systems. Emulators for Game Boy Color, Game Boy, NES, Sega Master System, Sega Game Gear, and PC Engine have all been built into the firmware of the Revo itself. You launch them just as you would launch a Game Boy Advance game. The Game Boy Color and Game Boy emulators work for the most part and only have a few hiccups on a couple games. The other four, however, don't run perfectly, and the PC Engine emulator in particular isn't even worth trying right now due to very low frame rates. I decided to do some further testing when it comes to the compatibility of Game Boy Advance games by trying a couple of other types of ROMs, ROM hacks and homebrew. Most homebrew games worked for me. Out of the 10 I tested, only about 2 of them failed to boot. As for ROM hacks, however, I only had Pokemon ROM hacks to test with. About a third of those wouldn't boot at all. The reason why probably has a lot to do with the testing environments. ROM hacks aren't generally built to run on their original system since they're usually tested using emulators. The Game Boy Advance might not have the hardware capabilities to load these heavily modified files. Homebrew games, however, are built to be played on their original systems, hence the higher compatibility. There are a few last things that need to be mentioned about the Revo, and that's its last two main features. First off is that AV out cable we saw earlier. We plug it into the Revo on one end and the TV on the other. The result is that your picture and audio are passed through your television. That sounds awesome on paper if it weren't for one problem. The jack for the AV cable is extremely sensitive. If I even so much as move the Revo in my hands, I sometimes mess up the signal. It's quite a pain to deal with. I practically have to become statuesque if I expect to maintain that connection. Lastly is the plug-in for the Game Boy Advance link cable. Awesome! You can use this to play with other Game Boy Advance systems or other Revo handhelds. And as great as that sounds, it also has a design issue. Because of its placement on the system, you can only use the link cable. Other important adapters such as the GameCube cable and the Wi-Fi adapter can't even fit in the Revo due to the small hooks that are on these adapters. Even if they somehow could, they'd end up covering up other buttons on the system. It's a huge missed opportunity by the Revo team, and it's pretty disappointing. Well, that pretty much wraps up what I have to say about the Revo K101 Plus. I'm not really sure how I feel about this handheld. It seems for every great feature it offers, it has some kind of flaw that ends up putting a bad taste in my mouth. The only reason the system has any value to it is the K card. Without that, the Revo wouldn't even be able to stand on its own feet. Don't get me wrong, I want to enjoy this system. I brought it to work with me every day and played it at lunch, and I really enjoyed playing Game Boy Advance games again. But while the Revo may have many features to it that make it unique from a Game Boy Advance, its design choices are its ultimate downfall. The quality of the plastic, the buttons, the screen having issues out of the box, the link cable plug, the sensitivity of the AV out function, the battery, the speaker placement. While these problems are small individually, they snowball into this massive pile of poor choices and quality control issues. I really wanted the Revo to be my new Game Boy Advance. It had so much going for it. But right now, I just can't recommend it. You'd be better off saving up for a Game Boy Advance SP and getting yourself a flash cartridge. It might be a bit more expensive, but if you want to truly enjoy your Game Boy Advance games in handheld form, this would definitely be your best choice. Well guys, I appreciate you taking your time to watch this video today. It's ultimately unfortunate that the Revo didn't end up being what I hoped for, but it's not a lost cause. With more effort from the Revo team, maybe we'll see a better K101 Plus later down the line. But what do you guys think? Maybe you already own a Revo K101 Plus yourself. Have you had similar issues? Or do you think mine was just a dud? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. But until next time, my friends, this is Dr. Modalot signing off.